Yes.
Hey, Kenneth, have you started? We're on. Hi, everybody. Hello. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming to tonight's Spring Rights Literary Festival event. I'm the Program and Grant Director of the Community Arts Partnership in Ithaca, New York, and we serve Tompkins County. The Spring Rights Literary Festival is one of 6 annual programs that we have, all bringing artists and audiences together. We also have a gallery, and we have 6 grant programs for Tompkins County artists and not-for-profits doing arts events. We have a creative recovery coming up due on the 2nd, and it's the only grant we have where we're asking the community to help fund it. So I want you to know that you can donate to the Community Recovery Fund, Creative Recovery Fund, or you can apply for it, or both. Our website is artspartner.org. That card over there, and our website is at the end on the bottom. The Spring Rights Literary Festival has 20, maybe like 15 more events between now and the end of June, including an event after this at 6:30 on Zoom, which rather than list all the events, because there's a lot, as you know. Please look at springrights.org and go to as many as you can. Many of them are on Zoom, and the live ones are live streamed. So I'm also going to ask for donations, like not-for-profit. We have to keep doing. Rights is free. If you feel happy to donate to the Community Arts Partnership, just go to our website and click on the donate page. And thank you very much.
Don't you have a basket today?
No. Stuff money, yeah, no. I mean, you can hand me money. That would be fine. These are my Zoom notes. I almost said, please stay on mute. I have this clipboard, and if you haven't put your name already, I'm going to send it around. The artists who are reading don't have to fill out the clipboard. I know you're here. But everyone else, I really want to send you a survey to find out how you heard about the event. We've spent a lot of money on, and maybe I don't need to. You know, if I find out that 90% of the people who came to events came from word of mouth, that's going to help us a lot next year, and I'll have more money to pay the artists than we had this year. So please put your name to that clipboard that I'm going to pass around. Just keep passing it around the room, and that would be amazing. And last, thank our wonderful Spring Rights sponsors. They are Ithaca College, Wegmans, M&T Bank, CFCU Community Credit Union, the Odyssey Books, and the Ithaca Marriott. We're also partnering with the Buffalo Street Books. We received grant support from New York State Council on the Arts, Poets and Writers, and Tompkins County Tourism. Our media sponsors are Ithaca Voice, WI Radio, and WSKG. And so we begin. And I'm going to start by introducing Nato. And thank you very much for coming. Enjoy.
where many of you have enjoyed wonderful readings in the past. I've given a few readings here myself over the years. I don't know who coordinates this particular room anymore, but whoever contributed it so that Buffalo Street Books could have us here. I'm grateful. Thank you, Buffalo Street Books. So it's a bookstore. There's a lot of books for sale. They're going to stay open a little late today after the reading, so you can shop. Among the books, of course, are copies of From the Finger Lakes, a memoir anthology that our readers will be reading from today. By the way, this is the third anthology that Cayuga Lake published over the last several years, focusing on regional writers and writing about the region. Some of the writers don't actually live around here anymore, but fondly remember their time in the Finger Lakes. As we all know, it's a very inspiring place. So as Robin said, I'm Peter Fortunato. I'm one of the founding editors of Cayuga Lake Books. Our other editors are Stacy Murphy. Where are you, Stacy? Hi, Stacy. And Jack Hopper and Edward Hauer, who are the two editors of the anthology. So Edward edited the prose section and Jack edited the poetry section. Two poets and three writers will be reading selections from their work in the anthology. The majority of books contributors wrote vivid personal reveries about growing up and making their way in New York's Finger Lakes region. However, some with roots here also wrote about their memories of experiences in faraway places and times. Anthology's authors are diverse in ethnicity, gender, and age, and this is also evident in the topics they address and some topics that they're going to be reading about today. You'll see. I'd also like to point out, as I was noticing when preparing these notes, many of the authors in the anthology are participants in other events featured during the Spring Rights Festival this year. So that's nice. The anthology, as well as the other books we've published over the past 10 years, are available here at Buffalo Street Books. If they're not on the shelves, ask them to order them. Or go to our website. It's easy to remember the name, CayugaLakeBooks.com. And you'll find instructions there for how to buy our books if you do so online. And now for today, with readers going, and the first reader will be Alex Chertok. Alex Chertok has poems and essays published in Plowshares, the Kenyon Review, Pleiades, the Massachusetts Review, Coppernickel, and Best New Poets 2016. He was a finalist in 2021 for Missouri Review's Jeffrey E. Smith's Editor's Prize. He currently teaches through the Cornell Prison Education Program. Alex.
You, everyone, and for someone who works from home, this is a shock to the senses. You know, this is, and it's a bracing, good shock. Thanks so much for having me here. I know you were so integral in getting me into those pages. Thank you, Stacy and Peter and Edward and Robin, who seems to be omnipresent and doing it all. Thank you. And I think I may have family there, like in the phone, streaming here. So hello to the family. If they've been able to. So I've got two poems. You know, while I was writing them, I was keenly aware that the world was not nearly as invested in his decline from Alzheimer's as I was. You know, there's something a little bit narcissistic about a project like this, and totally useless, right? I mean, like, there's no healing. Like, these poems don't heal him. These poems don't restore his memory. Like, I was aware of that. I was aware of the kind of futility of writing about a subject like this. I think any memoirist has to deal with these things, right? I mean, the kind of inward navel gazing of it all. Any poetry of witness has to kind of come to terms with it. But all we can do as writers is write towards our obsessions, and this was a total obsession of mine for the last few years of his life. You know, it dominated my time logistically. It dominated my thoughts and my artistic headspace. So I had no choice about this. The poems that feel like, you know, less about his individual decline and more about just like the phenomenon of memory and language being lost, and that seems like the great fear, I think, of the human species, to watch be lost. I mean, it's the thing that makes us human, and for writers especially, that those are our primary weapons, memory and language, and to watch that go is just, I mean, it was devastating, of course, but it was such an interesting subject matter. I had no choice but to do my best to you know, to meditate on it. Also, this is the last thing I'll say. The time that my father was declining, and though that conflict just wild and also really rich art, you know, literary terrain. So this first poem is kind of like a reversal of birth. I was trying to kind of undo some of the things that we do around birth, because it felt undeniable to me that my dad was kind of giving, not birth, but like giving death to his memory. There were some new loss to the way, in, you know, conversely, my son, every week there's like new growth. I mean, it's just it was such an amazing confluence of things. So like, instead of you know, certain expressions you're going to hear negated, and like even just the language of like push during delivery. I'm just to prime you, some of that will be tried to be undone in a poem that I called Unbirth. Hold your hand against the concave of his mind, and a tiny flicker of trees. Pull, we yell. Grip my father's hand, but the memory crowns, then waits like a match hiss into a toilet bowl. We coil his long sighs afterbirth through our fingers, so in unlove already, to the unmoon. Gone go the mountains as they were. Gone the drive up the coast and the husk in the ocean's voice, and the apple from lunch in the unbump of its bitterness. And then a porker, my brother's name, slow out his mouth, my father's first begotten. Pull, pull, as Greg leads him, an unleavening, and me, the unmid on call, who knows not which hole they come out of, in which of his hells buried or smokestack, on what bottom to land with what sandy thud, rooting for my father's milklessness. And just more, while I was writing these poems, I had this kind of faulty belief that I was forging new literary terrain. Yeah, I was writing poems that had never been written before. I mean, I think we all need that belief, and I had it. I kind of fooled myself into it, and it's that the more I write Alzheimer's poems, and the more they're starting to be published, the more I see them everywhere. I mean, nothing original about writing about the loss of memory and language. But it's a kind of phenomenon like you buy new shoes and then all of a sudden everyone's wearing them, like, because you're kind of primed to see that. There must be a psychological term for that. I mean, I suppose it's a phenomenon of what was that? It's the same kind of phenomenon as like when we write anything, especially late at night. You know, we think it's perfect and Shakespearean, and then we wake up, right, and then we see it for what it is. You know, a really mediocre piece of writing. But I think we need that delusion that we're coining new terrain, just as a way to sustain us. And this poem, the title is the first line also. It's called Ever Since Alzheimer's Cut a Hole in Your Pocket. Ever since Alzheimer's cut a hole in your pocket for Judy Garland's name and your son's birthdays to hourglass out, be my lord on the phone and bless you at the goodbye. This is what a mind unseated from its horse finds on its hands and knees in the field. Your luggage buried so deep and unmeddled, it's beyond beachcombing. Go ahead, Dad, bless me. Though how lordly is my loudest worry, will this wasting away become mine? The same as a decade ago after I'd kissed against a wall under the base's carotid pulse, a girl who months later caught meningitis. What if I gave you a taste of your own worship? If every call by stuffing your unmendable pockets with God gushiness? How worthy would you feel if I knelt down with you to sift through sand, crumbs of your lineage, to brush the schmutz from between your fingers, and cradle bruised from the fall? The thoughts of the strobe-lit girl are quiet forever in their sleeve. How would you like it if my thoughts stuck like yours, like any true lord's, in an end of record sun praise? Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. Sections from her essay as poems in the anthology. Mary Gilliland's poetry has been anthologized in Nuclear Impact, Broken Atoms in Our Hands, and Now is the best innovative writing in the multimedia Strange Histories, a bizarre collaboration, and in Wild Gods, the ecstatic contemporary prose. Find her award-winning collection, The Ruined Wall Castle Garden, at your favorite bookstore, or find out how to purchase the website marygilliland.com. It's Mary.
Thank you. Hello. You'll also be able to purchase what will be my new book at the time, The Devil's Fools, which just won an award last month. So thank you, Peter. Like that. Is this good? Yes? Okay. Before I start, I also want to mention I'm project with contemporary Ukrainian poetry, and I'm donating series bilingual to libraries, college libraries and universities and public library systems. And I'm doing this by word of mouth. And so I'm giving you the word, and if anyone has an area or a library or whatever to recommend, I have a message I can send. If the library has funds to buy the book, great. If they don't, here I am. Okay, thank you. I'm going to read from this essay, Ecologic. And Ecologic about an event that really happened in Ithaca in 1993. But it's also about much more. And so today I'm going to read some paragraphs here and there throughout the essay that are largely about the much more part. So you can buy this book, or if you already have it, you can buy extra copies for your library or your cousin, and find out the details of everything that happened in this chemical spill. Classic heavy March snowfall. Hundreds of gallons of the hazardous solvent, Varsol, leaked from a storage area at a milling plant on Ithaca's South Hill above 6 Mile Creek. This was a nightmare come true for my husband and myself, for the house we had worked so hard to repair, and for the land around it. The company from which it leaked does the finish work on metal parts for engines. It operates on 50 acres across the street and uphill from our house. We are buffered from the facility by acres of wood and wasteland roamed by deer. The company's work supports new product development in many businesses, particularly the aerospace industry. You might call Therm the manufacturer's manufacturer. Parts are trucked in to be ground, milled, turned, welded, assembled, and tested. Finished parts are cleaned of fine metal shavings with solvents. Bar salt. We're having an audience member with us, Bill. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay, back to the prose. Finished parts are cleaned of fine metal shavings with solvents. Varsol was the one in use back then. Fortunately, we have a historical record dating back 10 years of our complaints about airborne odors and stream-borne sheens that turned the flowing water iridescent. It is written to the Ithaca Department of Public Works, the Tompkins County Department of Health, and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. A few weeks after the spill, representatives from the DEC met with us in our living room. They used our file as evidence to persuade Therm Incorporated of their responsibility for environmental cleanup. Our uphill facility is a family-run operation with a community involvement. Eventually, I invite the owners of Therm to visit our house, tour my upstairs study with its view of the fresh runs through their land, and then ours on its way down to 6 Mile Creek. W.H. Auden may have posited that the tree survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper. But the Sproles accepted my invitation. We had a good conversation about how poetry is manufactured at my drafting near my study window with its leafy view. And then we took a walk around the property and along a bit of the South Hill Recreation Way, where I find poetry in my motion. ... When and why had I first become ecologically conscious? To begin with, during Northeast New Jersey's construction of one of its first suburbs, my father's company, RCA, transferred him from Camden to Harrison, and we moved from Philadelphia as I was about to start kindergarten. Ours was part of the mass migration now known as white flight. Racial segregation heavily subsidized by industry and the government. Idyllic woods surrounded our 3-street neighborhood. The canopy where I played was dappled with sunlight and the occasional whistle of a commuter train. New Jersey was still 50%. As I grew up, however, so did the population of the town, until most of the trees were felled, replaced by new houses. In high school, I saved money for college working at the local library, and that's where I read Gary Snyder's poems. A decade. After a Gary Snyder reading, he invited me to apprentice in California. I got to live in the back country, to meditate before breakfast, pour cement and hammer nails, cook on a wood stove, participate in a Buddhist study group around the fire pit, trim kerosene and pump drinking water when the well went dry, as it did every summer. Peter and I lived in a meadow. Shelves for our belongings were wooden shipping crates salvaged from San Francisco's Chinatown. The time in California and my love of nature and my dedication to harmonizing human values with nature's values. But during those years, the mid-70s, California experienced terrible droughts, and my body needs rainy woodlands. East we went. It wasn't easy to find a community eclectic and insightful as the folks we left on San Juan Ridge. And so we made the roundabout journey to Ithaca, where Peter and I had met. I remember that at that very time, an old Cornell landfill out by the airport excavated a can imprinted with a slogan widespread while I was growing up: better living through modern chemistry. I had entered college as a prospective chem major before switching to English, And now I was soon to have some real world experience with chemicals. Skipping again. We would periodically receive soil sampling results and surveys, tables, and percentages. My brother Jerry, a geologist, perused the numbers. He quickly reached a conclusion that was confirmed by summary reports from companies that did the cleanup for Therm. We had no level of contamination to worry about. Yes, he said, the soil samples contained volatile organic compounds, but in such minuscule amounts that only spooning the dirt into my mouth for a number of years would pass the threshold that New York State considers safe exposure to the chemicals. He and I did not talk about Rachel Carson's conclusion in Silent Spring that no level of exposure to toxic chemicals should be considered safe. For an outfit like Therm, accountability is built in because it ties to with its community, rather like all companies were back when my father was transferred to Harrison. The brother who assured us about safety of house and grounds, like many geologists, works for a contamination cleanup company. He has routinely monitored outflows from major petroleum companies. One time, he showed day early and found the readings much higher than the usual monthly numbers. It's the big guys we have to worry about, he says, not the local family company. Indeed, in spring 2017, the Syracuse Time Union reported that during the past several decades, ExxonMobil has been responsible for 3,500 spills across New York State awaiting cleanup. Then there's a little bit about my teaching, and then I'm going to end with one paragraph. In the Tao Te Ching, a book included on the syllabus of every writing seminar I ever taught, 3 simple practices are recommended. Exercise compassion, practice frugality, do not put the self first. Lao Tzu calls these the 3 treasures that are safe. I trust these principles more than all the thou shalt nots I memorized and recited as a child. And I managed to practice those 3 treasures some of the time. Like all practices, they are never perfected, but they can go a long way toward preventing crises. And when crisis hits, it's an opportunity to draw on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Our next reader will also be reading prose, and this is Lamar Herren, who taught at Cornell University for 30 years. He is the author of 10 books, 8 novels, The Lies Boys Tell, House of the Deaf, and Fractures, which, by the way, is a wonderful book about fracking in the region, including fictionalized scenes that I think take place in the building. Fictionalized, of course. Yes. He's also written a book of short stories. His memoir, Romancing Spain, which appears in Cayuga Lake Books' anthology, recounts the adventure his Spanish wife and he had when they were married, as well as his travels in the small towns of Spain. Here's the book.
Thank you. This is a lovely book, and I feel honored to be a part of it. I really do. So, this is the only memoir writing I've done, what I'm going to read to you all today, and it's the first part, the first chapter of it appears in this book in the anthology. I thought I might just tell you a little bit about how it came about. My wife and I had this idea. This was like 1999 or 2000. I can't for the life of me remember which year it was. I suppose I could figure it out. But in that time, we'd seen a lot of Spain and driving around it and living in cities, but we decided we would just spend what amounted to eventually 3 months driving around the country looking for what we call the perfect pueblo. We had was we were looking for a place to retire, but that wasn't what we were going to do. We just wanted to just kind of explore the town, small towns of Spain, which are wonderful in many ways. My wife came from a small town, at least she was brought up there. And that's how this memoir, Romance in Spain, begins. But what actually allowed it to happen was that as we were traveling around town, my wife and I'll wake up very early. And we had a real problem here because I was dying to get out and explore whatever town arrived in. But I just couldn't do it because I'd be taking her back over things so I had to do something for like hours to kill time before she woke up. This is true. It's not an exaggeration at all. I had a little Mac that was a laptop computer with one of the kind of original ones. And I just got into the habit of writing about the last town we had visited as I was waiting to visit, and for my wife to wake up and visit the town where we were. And this became kind of a sea towns. The other part of it, which is the lifeline and the lifeblood of this writing. The other part of the book, however, deals with the adventures and the ordeals, rather than adventures, that we had to get married in 1970. I'm not going to get into that, but that's half of the book. Romance in Spain is which is kind of interwoven. So the book runs on two currents, those two currents. What I thought I would do is just read at the beginning. This is, by the way, what looks here in the score. I think I'll just read from it because it's exactly the same as what's in the anthology. And you'll see at the very beginning, Sancho Panza and Don Quixote are mentioned, and there's no travel around Spain that is not in some way likened to that. Believe me. I might as well get it out of the way in the first sentence, and there it is. I say to my wife, you play Sancho Panza to my Don Quixote, and one day I'll return the favor. She reminds me that Panza is a squat tub man who is finally a bigger dupe than Quixote himself, and doesn't really think that she's suited for the part. My wife is considerably shorter than I am, this is true. Not squat, but not exactly willowy either. Spanish, not from La Mancha, but Valencia, the region in Spain where the best fruit and vegetables are grown, and the women are renowned for their beauty. My wife is a dreamer, but not a dupe. She likes to fantasize, but she knows the ground she stands on. Old ground. The town in which she was raised had been founded by the Iberians. Then came the Phoenicians and the Greeks. The Romans, with a single lovely arch, spanned the ravine, and the bridge still stands. The Visigoths ousted the Romans, then the Moors took the town and built their citadel on top of the hill. The Christians built their church within the walls of the Alzheimer. My wife used to dig lopsided coins out of the rubble of the neighborhoods, los barrios bajos. These coins were embossed with Roman emperors' heads. Even as a child, she knew she's 3,000 years history. In the summer, they hung a cloth across one side of the bull ring and showed the move the priests approved. This is 1969. Well, what I'm talking about before that, this is in the 50s. When she wrote pure Franco. In the summer, they hung a cloth across one side of the bull ring and showed the movies the priests approved of. These were mostly American movies, extolling the virtues of a small town hero he saved his town, from some thieves. My wife's favorite was Jim Stewart, and she fantasized that one day a tall, drawling American would come save her. From what? 3,000 years of history. That bull ring was carved out of the stone of the hillside on which it was built. Sure, she could dream, but she knew when she sat on. What exactly am I proposing? There are towns like my wife's scattered all over Spain. Our children are gone, our daughter in college, our son out in his life. We have some time. Why don't we rent a car and travel the country in search of what? Perhaps a town that somehow transcends all the rest. The proto-town that set the standard for those like my wife's. Hers is named Bocairente. It is located in the hills of Valencia, 60 kilometers from the sea. It manufactures blankets. As picturesque as it is, the town can be almost baroque in its small-minded malice, its class hatreds and its grudges that fade with time. In towns like hers, 3-4 generations sit around their mesas camillas at night, cloth draped over their laps, and you're warning them from beneath some unflattering aspects of her town she wants me to remember, just in case my nature is about to run away with me. Surely Sancho Panza gave Don Quixote similar advice. That night you set your sights on is a goat herd. He'll kick you in the cojones before he'll fight you fair and square. This goat children's. Those books are all moldy, and those times are past. She'd slipped into her part. But like Panther, she does not say no to traveling the country with an American who grew up believing that surely there was a city on a hill somewhere that did not glitter pictures of McDonald's, but with the settled wealth of centuries. What would it take for me to make up the perfect town? Why don't we sit down and draw up a list of features? And I'd back off. I tell her I wouldn't know where to begin. Sure I would. For instance, just how attractive would I want a town to be before the tourists start? A town too beautifully preserved might ensure its own destruction. What had been a modest little palace becomes all style. That Cañorial, a gift shop, is typical. Does there come a point in beauty where beauty and authenticity are mutually exclusive categories? At what point does the balance begin to tip? This is my wife's least effusive. She can be in her enthusiasms. The Spanish are by nature an exclamatory. Their rhetoric is such that they can repeat a word phrase 3, 4, 5 times and never depart from the rhythms of common speech. Pero hombre, pero hombre, pero hombre. K this and K that. Puts them in the presence of an impressionable foreigner, though, and they sober up. They measure, instructive, rarely begrudging, but in their tone, they set up a distance, and you know they are keeping something for themselves. You wonder what it is, since they are the most obliging hosts. 28 years we've been married, make that 51 now. 28 years we've been married, and there's a reserve in my wife I still haven't broken through to. Such a theatrical people, it stands to reason they are holding something back. I think of those small round tables, mesas camillas, 3 or 4 generations seated at that still center. That don't be such a Quixote. My wife shakes her head. Which do you fall in love with first, the woman or the country? She kisses me on the cheek. She smiles. I don't want to give the wrong impression. My wife is still very girlish. She had the town in which she grew up. Her father was the town secretary, that is, the town authority. And my wife, stunningly pretty as a child, was known as the secretariat, or the little secretary. And everybody buttered her up. She became a gleeful consumer of what the town had to offer. Perhaps 20 years after she left the town, I happened to be walking alone in the old neighborhood, the Barrio Medieval, and I heard one woman whisper to another, "Es el marido de la secretariat," the husband of the secretariat. Her currency had lasted that long. Yet that mysterious reserve, and that poise, Everyone knows the Spanish have their reclusive side, their Santa and their San Juan de la Cruz, a cell into which they withdraw. Mas Quixote que Quixote, my wife, still smiling, delivers her judgment of me. But there comes a point when nobody would be married to one, a befuddled old fool whipping himself into a frenzy on the high, desolate plain of La Mancha. Only Tompkins. And it continues.
Thank you, Lamar. It's a wonderful book, and I admire your ability to write about your wife. Our next reader will also be, and this is Minfong Ho. Minfong Ho was born in Myanmar of ethnic Chinese parents, raised in and educated in Taiwan, and then at Cornell University. He worked as a journalist in Singapore, taught at Chiang Mai University in Thailand, a food program on the Thai border for Cambodian refugees. The author of many short stories and several young adult novels, she lives in where she and her husband have raised 3 children. Minfong.
It's very hard not to trip on these wires. So I'm going to read an excerpt as part of this memoir anthology, which deals with a book that I wrote many years ago, which is probably standard in anthologies for memoirs. And I had sort of thought that this phase of the life that I was writing about was more or less over. I had worked while I was massive exodus of refugees from Cambodia back in the 80s. And it's only when I recently reread the excerpt that I realized it's not a phase, and that the current situation with the Ukrainian refugees brings back so many feelings and memories that I had while I was working with the Khmer ones. So here is a sort of choppy, too choppy selection of the excerpt in here. It's still very hard to talk about Cambodia, and having it joined with the Ukrainian refugees now makes it even harder. But I think without my having acknowledged it, I had been sucked into the of silence that's so often generated by misery. The Cambodian refugees themselves had not spoken much of their own suffering, so how could I? One doesn't talk about such unspeakable things. I remembered, yes, not want to or could not talk about the dead and the dying, starving and the shooting, the pain and the suffering. Most terrible of all, the total senselessness of it all. Why had it happened? And most terrible of all, why had it happened? Why was it still happening? And why was it inflicted upon even the children? How could such things be talked about? The Cambodians that I saw were for the most part themselves silent, especially the kids in the malnutrition ward where I worked. I had volunteered worked as a nutritionist with a NGO relief agency on the border. I spent a lot of time in these children's wards, and they were too weak to cry, their mothers too stoic or perhaps too tired to talk. It was a terrible thing, the silence, like some thief that had descended and choked everyone underneath. Being born and raised in Thailand, I had seen my share of beggars, malnourished children of tribal hill tribes on the streets of Bangkok, but I had never seen suffering on such a massive scale. I remember that when I went to one of the first border camps in Nong Tan, there had been tall watchtowers of split bamboo erected. If you climbed to the top of a watchtower, you would see thousands, hundreds of thousands huddled like a churning brown ocean stretched out in every direction as far as the eye could see, all of them uprooted, helpless, silent. It was overwhelming. And yet, seeing the refugees somehow confirmed one of my most deep-rooted fears, that one's regular, mundane life could be so suddenly and drastically disrupted. Growing up in a Chinese immigrant family as I did, I was used to hearing stories of how, for instance, she left her childhood home in Shanghai, likely one summer, and was never able to return because the Japanese soldiers had taken it. And it was only about some 40 years later that she returned to that house to see it long since burnt out. And she couldn't even find her mother's grave. Similarly, I was born in Burma. Never go into that, but it's a similar immigrant story of being uprooted and having not a whole lot to do with, well, I don't know, business of one's childhood, photographs, and so on. The lives of these Cambodian refugees had been described away. Like us, they had been quietly living one day with only a distant reality, and the next day everything had changed. They had to move, they had to leave everything behind, not only time with possessions, but everything they were familiar with, language, culture, religion, country. In a literal sense, none of us could ever go home again. And another similarity that I hadn't thought of, drawing at the time I was writing this years ago, was that I had grown up with a similar set of political dynamics in Southeast Asia, within Southeast Asia, that the Ukrainians probably had a sense of growing up in the Ukraine next to Russia. So the sort of regional tension. Then too, I felt that the fate of these touched close to home because they were very much like people like some Cambodian words that had the same Sanskrit root. And the clothing, the Cambodian dances, the Buddhist religion, all seemed very familiar to me. Basically, I identified with them simply because I liked them. And they looked like members of my family. They could have been my brothers and sisters, my parents. And again, the analogy came to me with the Ukrainian refugees now. The people witnessing their kind of easy empathy with them that I felt with the Khmer refugees, because you looked alike. It's not racist, they remind you of your family. A very basic thing. So let's see. I don't know, this is about part of how I related to Khmer kids that I fed. I had these these feeding programs at a lot of the camps where they would run up to the truck and they would, hold out their bowls and they would get a ladle full of food. But I really couldn't communicate with them. What could I have said to you? I hate you, I need you, I hurt, I can't bear it, I am bearing it, go. I come back, touch me, hold me, leave me alone. And how could I have said any of that? Even if I was with them at the border, I had hardly been able to. Instead, I had cooked and trucked food around and fed them, maintaining their silence, that unbridgeable. And every day that I kept it up, I had known it was a sham. I was ashamed of being so useless, so weak, so well fed myself. How could I live with them? They had nothing? And yet, of course, there really was no them, no. I was them, each child, each barefoot, snot-nosed child. I had been so much like them when I was little. I knew them, I was familiar with their games, and most devastatingly of all, I liked them. I liked their gumption, their spirit, their sudden giggles. If I had been 10 or 15 years younger, I would have wanted nothing more than to be friends with them. And separated by a few years and an arbitrary twist of fate, we had diverged into such different paths. They to endure war and I to watch them endure. But they had endured, these sweet, tough kids, tougher by far than I could ever be. They had endured, cracked under the straining of just watching them endure. And yet I felt somehow compelled to, well, I wasn't compelled to think about them. I just couldn't help but think about them when I came back to Cornell to be a grad student again. It was a very hard juxtaposition. And I remembered not the misery in the camps, but the slivers of joy that I happened upon. There was one malnutrition where I was sitting next on a cot. They're made of split bamboo as well. Everything was made of split bamboo. I was sitting on a cot, and there was this really like stick baby, 4-year-old, with patchy skins and falling hair. He was being held by his older sister, who was no more than 8 or 9 years old. And I sat next to her, and I saw that she had rubber bands on her wrist, which a lot of girls in Asia do to bunch up their hair. So I pulled one of her and snapped and twanged it back, and it snapped on her wrist. And she laughed. And then she reached out and twanged one of the rubber bands on my wrist, because I had them too. And I laughed. And suddenly, there was some laughter, some noise. And then soon a whole group of little kids just around, crowded around me, and we took turns. They twanged my rubber band, I twanged their rubber bands, and that was the big entertainment of the day, it seemed. So it was moments like that that made me feel like I can remember them. I can, if nothing else, celebrate them. And I think that's what a lot of us are learning to do with the Ukrainian. There's not a pity sense of being taken aback. You just the resilience. I think maybe as many years this afternoon, I thought twanging of the rubber bands. Maybe that's what draws me to them. It's it's the resiliency of these refugee kids. They stretch really far and be flexible, and yet they have the capacity to snap back and really make a difference. So that's what I wrote, and I guess just to finish it off, this is a letter that I actually sent to my editor when I lived there for about 2-3 years with my husband and our 2 children. And I got to finish the revisions of The Clay Marble, which is the book that I landed up writing about these refugee kids. And to Margaret in New York, and said, "It has been a gift to be able to finish up the story here, with the swallows diving in and out above the fields right outside my window, the mango trees, the stone's throw from my desk. Everything is a seamless whole. The fields, the story, the past, the present, Dara, myself." Dara was one of the characters that I made up that I sort of met on the border. "I couldn't have envisioned before how life goes on after the misery and suffering I saw on the border. The last glimpse I had of children like Dara was of their ox carts heading past the landmined to their own war-torn country. And now I have met them on the other side. The country here, and this is in Laos, makes all the behind the rattan curtain in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, is very poor. But, and this makes all the difference in the world for me, I find the children playing here, as I did on the border. I did not make it all up. It is a solipsistic nightmare. It was not some solipsistic nightmare I had shut up in a cold house in upstate New York. It all happened, it exists, and it is something that makes me feel like I have come home and have brought part of my home here. So I think that's one of the ways that this collection of stories in the memoir has been very evocative for me, because it's not just about the past or what's what's outside of Ithaca, whatever. It's the weaving, interweaving of what was past and present. And I'm really proud to be part of the contributors, and I hope you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minfong. So to conclude today's reading, we will have Warhaft, and Gail also is one of the writers in the anthology who has both a piece and poems. She's going to be reading poems today. Gail Holst-Warhaft is a poet, prose writer, and translator of Greek literature. She is the author of 2 collections of poetry, Penelope's Confession and Lucky Country, and a number of books about Greek music and poetry. She was Poet Laureate of Tompkins County for 2011 to 2012. Her most recent book is Nisiotika. I think I pronounced it pretty well. Music and bittersweet songs of the Aegean Islands. Her website is gailholstwarhaft.com. Here's Gail.
Thank you, Peter and Jack and Edward and everyone who contributed to more remarkable anthology. It makes you feel, if you're a writer, that you have plenty of material here and plenty of writers to interact with. You don't feel that you're in some small country. And yet, during the last 2 years, I think we've all felt very isolated in our own worlds. And the year 2020 for me was the year when I both felt grateful to be where I was and nowhere else, because Ithaca is still surrounded by a beautiful countryside, and you could go out into the countryside and enjoy. And I felt there was a sense of menace in the political, and of course to do with the plague that was affecting not just us but the whole world. There was some sense that it was both a time of beauty and reflection and solitude to some extent, but I also felt that there was a sort of menace and hanging over our life, as well as our four short poems, and this set in different seasons, and this was the sort of life we led. I was fortunate enough that with my husband we were able to hike a lot and time in the beauty of nature, and I think some of the sense that I had that this beauty was a fragile thing is in the poem. Spring. It began with wings, furled umbrellas of skunk cabbage, a fattening of branches, faint daubs and brushstrokes of ochre and green, pale as watercolor, and tiny particles that floated like smoke through the chill air. Walking in the forest, we half believed this promise would falter. Summer. Swimming in the lake near the black wall, we listened to the kingfisher's rasping cry as he skimmed the waters. An osprey passed overhead, bearing a fish like a bomb, ready to drop. The water no color, all colors, wrapping us in silk. The world now and forever surprising. Autumn. Trees lay shameless on the hills, weedy sumac by the railway track lit up like fireworks. The forest floor coated many colors, a gaudy show before the dark descended. A last fling that ended our affair with fragile things that fall. Winter. Visitors, geese, herons, wood framed in the bathroom window, its branches naked against the sky, were exposed by this dark sea, buffeted by that bend, reliant on roots that hold help us withstand. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Concise, very evocative. It's about 5:30. Buffalo Street Books has said they would be open for book sales. Before we adjourn, I wonder if any questions that anyone would like to address to any of the readers in particular, or would you rather simply socialize a little bit and buy books? Yes.
Well, I'm thinking of it definitely as questions and socialize, but I will a picture of all of our readers today.
What a great idea. Yeah, that's Stacy Murphy, one of our editors. Why don't you come up if you've read, and she's going to snap you. You can take your masks off, eh? Maybe. Masks on, sure. You decide.
You're on anyway.
Yes, I know. You can hear me better. Oh, yeah. Great idea. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. So, okay. Yeah.